Okay, so in this video we're going to talk about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are a class of biomolecules that include sugars and starches. They're called this because they contain a lot of carbon, and then we say hydrate in terms of hydrogen and oxygen atoms as well. In fact, the hydrogen to oxygen ratio is typically about 2:1. There are three major classes of carbohydrates. We got the monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. Monosaccharides include one single sugar, so this is the monomer version of a carbohydrate, and it's the smallest unit of carbohydrates. Disaccharides are where you have two monosaccharides linked up in a chain, and a polysaccharide is where you have many sugars and long chains, which are polymers. So some carbohydrates are actually polymers of sugars. Now, monosaccharides are simple sugars. These contain 3 to 7 carbon atoms, and this is just showing the general formula of the monosaccharide. Now, the monosaccharides, like we saw earlier, were the monomers of carbohydrates. Some important monosaccharides are the pentose sugars, so you have a 5-member ring. This includes ribose and deoxyribose. And the hexose sugars, which are 6-member rings. An example of this includes glucose. So this is showing some hexose and pentose sugars. The hexose sugars are 6-member rings, and we have things like glucose, fructose, and galactose. And an example of a pentose sugar would be like deoxyribose and ribose sugars. Now, a disaccharide is a double sugar here, and they're too large to pass through cell membranes. So some important disaccharides are things like sucrose, maltose, and lactose. They're actually formed by dehydration synthesis of two different monosaccharides. So an example of a disaccharide is sucrose. So sucrose is actually formed from the dehydration of glucose and fructose, making sucrose, and actually also yields water. So some important disaccharides in our body include sucrose, maltose, and lactose, and these are used in a variety of biomolecules. These are also sources of nutrition. Now, polysaccharides are polymers of monosaccharides. They're formed by dehydration synthesis of many different monomers. So some important polysaccharides include the starches and glycogen. Starch is where you have like carbohydrate storage that's used by plants. So a lot of plant sugars are in the form of starch. So you're going to find a lot of starch in potatoes and sweet potatoes and different types of tubers. We'll have a lot of starch. And glycogen is a carbohydrate storage usage of animals. You find a lot of glycogen stored within liver and skeletal muscle. So meat has sugar within it because there's glycogen within that meat, and it's actually a type of carbohydrate storage that animals use to basically power muscle metabolism. Now, we think of polysaccharides as not being very, very soluble, so these don't dissolve within water very well. Instead, polysaccharides are typically stored within cells of a particular muscle or liver cell. Now, this is just showing an example of a polysaccharide. Here we have the example of glycogen. So glycogen is how animals store glucose. So you see that glucose here is linked up in long chains, and they branch in a variety of ways. Now, this is an example of a polysaccharide because it's made of many monomers of glucose. Now, the reverse can happen too, where we can break down glycogen and basically yield individual glucose molecules that our cells can use for energy. So our liver and skeletal muscle can store glycogen as a form of energy storage for later use.